Income and wealth inequality are problems that do not fix themselves. Without intervention, they tend to get worse over time, and this is because wealthy people use surplus income to buy income-generating assets. Meanwhile, poor people spend their income just to survive and cannot get ahead. Over time, the already wealthy take a greater portion of national income. Private owners gradually increase their control over the society's productive assets, establishing oligopolies and monopolies. From this position, it becomes easier to raise prices due to a lack of competition, taking an even greater proportion of national income. Assets and income is then hoarded by fewer and fewer increasingly rich individuals. If allowed to, they continue amassing more of society's wealth until the poor have almost nothing. When large segments of society are excluded from sharing this national wealth, it leads to mounting economic grievances. The concentration of wealth reduces economic activity, innovation, growth, and opportunities. The middle class shrinks, the poor become poorer, but the wealthy continue taking a larger share of income. They use this money to then influence politics, consolidating their economic interests at the expense of poor citizens that are already disadvantaged in so many ways. Wealthy interests fund the politics of division and distraction to suppress class consciousness, but this can only work for so long. Technological changes like automation and economic changes like offshoring tend to make these things even worse for the poorest workers. The lack of opportunities and rising cost of living undermines public confidence in public and private institutions. Rising inequity produces social discontent and polarization. It erodes the social contract because society is no longer serving the needs of a growing number of its citizens. The poorest workers often react by calling for some form of socialism or communism. The wealthiest non-workers often respond by moving the country towards fascism to preserve their privileged positions. Tensions tend to then increase alongside growing class consciousness. The probability of public unrest, violent uprisings, or civil wars increases over time if income and wealth inequity continue rising. Countries like this are not politically stable, they're not economically resilient, and they're not socially harmonious. At some point, enough people will be so desperate and disenfranchised that rebellions can be triggered by seemingly very minor events. A country with unchecked rising income inequity is a country with a burning fuse. It is just a matter of time before grievances explode into violence. Countries must define tax regimes in their constitutions rather than in their legislation. This is very important because legislation is too easy to change. Governments are vulnerable to capture by special interests that want to lower their taxes. For example, when wealthy individuals donate money to help a political party win, the party then passes laws to reduce the tax rates paid by those same wealthy donors. Tax regimes that can be changed will be changed. This process will disproportionately benefit the wealthy over time. It leads to rising inequity levels with widespread negative effects. Taxes on both annual income and accumulated wealth must remain high for the wealthiest members of society. Progressive tax rates and related laws must then be embedded within constitutions to make them very hard to change. This part of the constitution must be protected by severe, mandatory penalties for anyone that publicly advocates for changing tax structures. Publicly advocating for lowering taxes on the wealthy must come with mandatory sentencing. Punishments for doing so must be based on a percentage of an individual's global income or wealth, whichever is higher. Each successive offense must then double the penalty amount. People who continue to publicly advocate for lowering taxes on the wealthy, or who encourage others to do so, must not be permitted to influence public opinion. Tax structures can only be debated by a randomly selected and nationally representative citizens' assembly. This citizens' parliament would vote on any proposed tax changes. Changes to the tax code must also then be put to a national referendum. This makes government harder to capture, and it ensures that tax regimes are difficult to change. The consequences of rising income and wealth inequality contribute to the downfall of societies and civilizations. This process repeats itself throughout history. The period preceding rising inequity usually coincides with calls for greater economic freedom for private enterprise and individuals, or some version of a kind of market economy with deregulation and the allowance of private personal gain. Entrepreneurial individuals want opportunities to innovate and build their own individual wealth. This logic has some merit, but Policy and legislative changes are often reactive to the previous conditions, and they overshoot a middle ground. People do not consider the predictable, long-term consequences. People that have obtained wealth, power, and status do not usually give up peacefully. They have the resources and the ability to suppress the early calls for greater equality. Because of these earlier successes, it is pursued with greater confidence. However, the underlying process of rising inequity continues. Eventually, the pressure for change increases until it can no longer be suppressed. The leveling of income and wealth inequity is usually a time of unrest, instability, and violence. The poorest segments of society will eventually win some concessions, and inequality will decrease. Often this coincides with a move towards public ownership and certain aspects of socialism and communism. After a period of political stability, however, and often after a generational change, the rich, once again, begin relentlessly seizing a greater share of society's wealth. Without intervention, the level of income and wealth inequity starts rising over successive generations. The social contract is gradually broken as many people struggle to maintain their standard of living in the face of widespread wealth hoarding by the few. The cycle eventually starts all over again with widespread violence, some concessions won by the poor, and then a move towards some form of socialism or a lot of social help. So this cycle is repeated itself throughout history, and the challenge is in breaking this cycle to create a society that maintains a middle ground between too much and too little inequity or inequality. A limited amount of income and wealth inequality may be unavoidable in complex societies, but it must not go to extreme levels. A good society must learn from the mistakes of past failed societies. It must put robust mechanisms in place that prevent income and wealth inequality from getting too extreme. Addressing income and wealth inequity requires a balancing act to avoid negative consequences from going too far in either direction. On one side, excessive income taxes will motivate skilled workers to leave the country. It will deter people from pursuing training or education to get ahead. An excessive wealth tax will cause capital flight and dissuade investments. It will also stifle economic improvements and infrastructure developments. On the other side of things, excessive income and wealth inequity will lead to a host of negative outcomes and societal breakdown. It produces monopolies that stifle innovation and entrepreneurship. It weakens consumer demand and hinders economic growth. It will decrease economic mobility for individuals, and eventually it reduces funding for social services and public investments. Too much income and wealth inequality undermines the health and education of lower income groups, which takes a toll on all of society. Extreme wealth inequality leads to corruption of the democratic process. It erodes social cohesion and trust. It increases crime and violence, and all of these come together to intensify political instability. In other words, some inequality is desirable to reward people for working hard or being very innovative or very entrepreneurial. It's needed for people who delay work to gain valuable skills that are needed by society. It's needed for people who want to save and invest their earnings. But too much inequality undermines the social contract and erodes the very fabric of society that keeps us all together.